Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act virtual pilgrimage. My name is the Reverend John Borthwick, and I'm the minister here at St. Andrew's. And over the many weeks, really, I'm looking at a schedule of about 24 weeks with a break around Christmas. We're going to be walking through the book 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. It's an amazing book. I think you'll find it engaging and informative, and it's so short as well. It gives you just sort of these tidbits of information to understand better a piece of legislation, agreed upon, amended, changed slightly over the years, but still in existence today, that was designed by the Canadian government to regulate the lives of Indigenous persons since all the way back in the late 1800s to this very day. It controls every aspect of their lives. I'm not sure there's any other form of legislation that would have this much oversight, this much control and restriction on an individual's life in a country like Canada, where we promote the idea of freedom and the ability to do and to live life in a way that is unrestricted, with the exception of things of, a criminal code and a highway traffic act. But the Indian Act, with its intentionality, is so much more different. So this episode is number 10 of the things you may not know about the Indian Act. And this one is number 10, declared potlatch and other cultural ceremonies illegal. And this one was in place up until the 1950s. Started all the way back in 1884 and now all the way into the 1950s. And essentially, it was preventing the ability for Indigenous peoples to share a part of their oral history, their traditions, and their cultures. And as I read this part of the book, I'm just stunned in some ways of that cultural practices would be regulated illegal, essentially, by the government. That practices of spirituality, and you wouldn't necessarily use words like faith in the same way as maybe a Christian church would, but certainly the practices that one has depended upon to pass on traditions and spirituality as a way of comforting, as a way of providing a passing along through ancestry and through generations of things that people have held dear, of transitions in people's lives that have been important and meaningful to mark. This act restricted those, said that they were illegal. Can you imagine if the government of Canada said that things like Christmas and Easter could no longer be recognized? You're not allowed to mark those or celebrate those or do anything on those specific festival days. Could you imagine if they went further and said that practices like baptism or Holy Communion would be banned? They must not happen. The good news, if there is a thread of good news within this piece of the act, is that, as Bob Joseph puts it, the government severely underestimated Indians' resistance to losing the freedom to continue with their traditions. So these traditions did continue. These traditions did go essentially underground, or these things happened quietly or secretly, which maybe the comparison isn't helpful in the sense of Christianity and Indigenous spirituality, but in the sense of that when the Chinese government restricted the ability for Christians to gather or to have Bibles or to engage with their faith in some way together, it all went underground and it became stronger. Sometimes faith traditions or cultural traditions or spirituality grows stronger when it faces the persecution that it might face. But this is happening in Canada for 75 years, up until the 1950s. Nope, you're not allowed to have that cultural event or that cultural experience. And I'm fascinated by a line in this chapter of the way Bob puts it, because I'm just going to read it, and then I'll invite you to just reflect on what this might mean for us. He says this: potlatchers continue to be held underground by a few determined communities, and the government eventually realized they were fighting a losing battle. Here's the few lines that I want you to think about. Also, after World War II, the Canadian public became more aware of basic human rights and the appalling treatment of Indigenous peoples. In 1951, the Indian Act was amended and the potlatch law was deleted. And the first legal potlatch was hosted by Chief Mungo Martin in Victoria in 1952. Maybe you caught the line. Maybe it's just me. But the line of, after World War II, the Canadian public became more aware of basic human rights. Do human beings need to take that long to become aware of basic human rights? Did it take 2 global wars? Did it take maybe the second one in order for it to fully be something that everyone had a sense that human beings have basic human rights? I don't know. That phrase just sits with me in a very strange way as I reflect on reading through this work and trying to understand better this Indian Act and the situation that our Canadian government, with intention, put and has placed Indigenous peoples for a very, very long time. Thank you for joining me on this virtual pilgrimage.